She escaped her toxic ex by sitting on a mafia boss's lap. His whisper turned her world upside down. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The sound of her own heartbeat was louder than the heavy bass vibrating through the floorboards of the obsidian tower. Evelyn pressed her back against the cool marble of the corridor wall, her breath hitching in her throat as she squeezed her eyes shut. She could hear him. Richard. His voice was not raised, which was infinitely worse than if he had been shouting. It was that smooth, oily cadence he used when he was hunting, a tone that sounded reasonable to strangers but promised violence to her. He was asking the concierge near the elevator about a woman in a green silk dress, his charm oozing through the air like a suffocating fog. She had thought she lost him 3 floors down in the casino, but Richard had the instincts of a bloodhound when his ego was bruised. She looked down at her wrist. The makeup she had applied that morning was beginning to rub off against the fabric of her clutch, revealing the faint, yellowish-purple bloom of a bruise in the shape of a thumbprint. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. If he found her here on the private club level where there were no cameras and fewer witnesses, he would not wait until they were home to punish her for running. She needed a place to hide. She needed to disappear. Her hazel eyes darted frantically down the hallway. To her left was a service exit that required a keycard she did not have. To her right, a set of double mahogany doors with a small, understated brass plaque that read simply, "Private." There was no security guard posted outside, which meant it was either empty or occupied by someone important enough to demand total isolation. It was a gamble, a terrifying roll of the dice, but the sound of Richard's footsteps clicking on the polished floor tiles grew louder. He was coming around the corner. Evelyn pushed off the wall and lunged for the mahogany doors. Her hand trembled as it grasped the heavy brass handle. It turned. The latch clicked silently, and she slipped inside, pressing the door shut behind her just as Richard's shadow stretched across the hallway floor. She leaned against the wood, her chest heaving, waiting for the handle to turn, waiting for him to barge in. 5 seconds passed. 10. The silence on the other side of the door remained unbroken. She let out a shaky exhale, turning around to survey her sanctuary, and immediately realized she had made a grave miscalculation. The room was not empty. It was a vast, dimly lit lounge that smelled of expensive leather, aged teak, and peat smoke. One entire wall was glass, offering a panoramic view of the city's skyline, where rain-slicked skyscrapers pierced the night like jagged teeth. In the center of the room, seated on a sprawling velvet sofa with a file of documents in one hand and a tumbler of amber liquid in the other, was a man. He was massive, even while seated. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the city lights behind him, encased in a tailored black suit that cost more than everything Evelyn had ever owned. He had stopped reading the moment the latch clicked. He did not look surprised, he looked lethal. His hair was jet black and slicked back, severe against the sharp angles of a face that seemed carved from granite. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in her veins, icy blue, piercing, and utterly devoid of warmth. He looked at her not like an intruder, but like a predator spotting a rabbit that had foolishly wandered into its den. "Get out," he said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the quiet room like distant thunder. It wasn't a request. Evelyn opened her mouth to apologize, to flee, but a sound from the hallway froze her. Richard's voice, right outside the door. "She went in here, you're sure?" "I saw a woman enter, sir," a muffled voice replied, likely a member of the waitstaff passing by. Evelyn's stomach dropped. The door handle began to turn. She didn't think. Instinct, primal and desperate, hijacked her brain. She couldn't be found cowering in the corner. Richard would drag her out by her hair. She needed to belong to someone. She needed to be untouchable. She crossed the distance between the door and the sofa in 3 long strides. The man in the suit watched her approach, his blue eyes narrowing slightly, his hand tightening around the glass of whiskey. He didn't move to stop her, perhaps out of sheer curiosity at her audacity. Just as the mahogany door swung open, Evelyn dropped her clutch and sank onto the stranger's lap. The impact of her soft body against his hardness was jarring. He was solid as a rock, his thighs like steel bands beneath the fine wool of his trousers. Evelyn draped her arm around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder to hide her terror, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and danger that clung to him. "Play along," she whispered, her breath hot and trembling against his skin. "Please." For a split second, he did nothing. He sat there, a statue of judgment, and she thought he was going to shove her onto the floor and serve her up to her tormentor. But then Richard stepped into the room. "Evelyn," Richard's voice cracked like a whip, laced with faux concern that barely masked his rage. At the sound of that name, the man beneath her shifted. His large, warm hand came up, not to push her away, but to rest heavily on her waist. His fingers splayed out, claiming her, pulling her flush against his chest with a strength that stole her breath. "I didn't realize we had company," the stranger said. His tone was bored, arrogant, and dangerous. He didn't look at Evelyn. His icy gaze was fixed over her shoulder, boring into Richard. Richard faltered. He had stormed in expecting to find a cowering girl. Instead, he found his girlfriend curled into the lap of a man who radiated the kind of power Richard could only dream of feigning. The intruder took a step back, his eyes darting between Evelyn's back and the man holding her. She's my girlfriend," Richard stammered, his confidence cracking. "She's drunk. She ran off." The stranger's hand moved on Evelyn's waist, his thumb tracing a slow, possessive circle against the silk of her dress. It was an intimate, shocking gesture that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "She doesn't look drunk to me," the stranger drawled. "She looks comfortable, and she certainly doesn't look like she wants to leave." Evelyn turned her head slightly, keeping her cheek pressed against the stranger's expensive suit jacket, and looked at Richard. She saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He was a bully, and like all bullies, he feared a bigger predator. And he was looking at a leviathan. "Evelyn, get up," Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Stop making a scene, we're leaving." She tightened her grip on the stranger's neck, a silent plea. "Don't let him take me." The stranger took a sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly in the silence. He set the glass down on the side table with a deliberate thud. Then, his arm tightened around her, anchoring her to him. "I think you have a hearing problem," the stranger said. The boredom was gone from his voice, replaced by cold steel. "The lady is occupied, and this is a private lounge. You have 3 seconds to walk out that door before I have security remove you. And by remove, I mean throw you off the mezzanine." Richard's face flushed a mottled red. He took a step forward, his fists clenching. "You don't know who I am. I'm Richard Vane. My father is." "I don't care who your father is," the stranger interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a velvet-trapped threat that made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. "But I know who I am, and if you don't disappear, you're going to find out too." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with violence. Richard looked at the man, really looked at him, at the bespoke suit, the scar intersecting his eyebrow, the absolute stillness of a man who had ended lives without losing sleep. Richard swallowed hard. His survival instinct finally kicked in. "Fine," Richard spat, backing toward the door. He glared at Evelyn with a look that promised retribution later. "Have your fun, Evie. You'll come crawling back when he's done with you." The door clicked shut, leaving them in silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn was shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. She was safe. Richard was gone, but she was still sitting on the lap of a terrifying stranger, her arm around his neck, his hand gripping her waist with bruising intensity. She moved to pull away, to stand up and stammer out an apology, but the arm around her waist tightened like a vice, locking her in place. "Sit," he commanded. Evelyn froze. She looked up, finally meeting his eyes fully. Up close, they were mesmerizing and terrifying, framed by thick lashes and a brow furrowed in irritation, or was it curiosity? Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, I needed." "You needed a shield," he finished for her. He lifted his hand from her waist and reached up, his fingers grazing her chin, tilting her face toward the dim light. He inspected her features with clinical precision, his thumb brushing over the frantic pulse beating in her throat. "Who is he?" My ex, she murmured. She tried to pull her face away, but he held her firm. He hurts you. It wasn't a question. His eyes dropped to her wrist, where the faint bruise peeked out. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath the stubble on his cheek. It's complicated, she said, looking down. It's never complicated, he corrected. It's weakness, his. He finally released her chin, and Evelyn scrambled off his lap, her legs wobbling as her heels hit the plush carpet. She smoothed down her dress, cheeks burning with shame. She had just used this man, invaded his space, and touched him in a way she hadn't touched anyone in months. I should go, she said, backing toward the door, though the thought of the hallway terrified her. Thank you again. I won't bother you. Sit down. He gestured to the leather armchair opposite him. It was a command, spoken with the same authority he had used on Richard. Evelyn hesitated. He's still in the building, the man said, picking up his whiskey again. Men like that don't leave. They wait. He's probably by the elevators right now, waiting for you to come out so he can drag you into a stairwell. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face because she knew he was right. Richard would wait all night if he had to. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice small. I want you to drink this, he said, sliding a second glass across the low table toward the empty chair. And I want you to tell me why a woman like you is running from a cockroach like him. A woman like me, she repeated, confusion knitting her brow as she tentatively sat on the edge of the armchair. Beautiful, he said simply, the word landing between them like a stone dropped in a pond. Terrified, desperate enough to jump a stranger. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. The expensive watch on his wrist glinted in the low light. My name is Marco, he said. Marco Bianchi. The name hit her like a physical blow. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Bianchi Enterprises owned half the skyline, the shipping docks, and the construction firms. But in the hushed whispers of the city's underbelly, stories she had heard from her brother before he disappeared, the name Bianchi meant something else. It meant the Mafia. It meant the kind of power that didn't just buy the law, it wrote it. She had jumped from the frying pan into the heart of a volcano. You're the CEO, she whispered. Among other things, Marco replied, his lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. He watched her realization, the way her pupils dilated as she understood exactly whose lap she had just occupied. You know who I am. Good, that saves time. I really should go, she said, starting to rise. Sit, Marco said again, softer this time, but no less commanding. He stood up, towering over the table, and walked around it until he was standing directly in front of her. Evelyn shrank back into the chair, looking up at him. He reached down, placing a hand on the armrest on either side of her, trapping her. He leaned in close, his face inches from hers. She could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with that intoxicating sandalwood scent. You asked me to play along, he murmured, his voice a low rumble in his chest. You involved me. You made me a participant in your little drama. I didn't mean to. You sat on my lap, Tesoro, he whispered, the Italian endearment rolling off his tongue like dark honey. You put your hands on me. You asked for my protection. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. Evelyn shivered, a mix of fear and a sudden, traitorous heat pooling in her belly. If he touches you again, Marco whispered, repeating the threat he had made to Richard, but this time it was for her alone. He won't have hands to do it with, I promise you that. He pulled back, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. But protection comes with a price, Evelyn. You don't get to walk out that door and pretend this didn't happen. Richard is a problem, but now... He reached out, his knuckle grazing her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw. Now I am your problem. Evelyn swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the door, then back at the man who could destroy her world with a phone call. She realized with a sinking sensation that she didn't want to leave. She was terrified of him, yes, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt entirely, completely safe from the monster in the hallway. What do you want? She whispered. Marco straightened up, buttoning his jacket. He held out a hand to her, It was large, scarred, and steady. "Come with me," he said. "We're leaving via the private elevator to the penthouse. You're staying with me tonight." "I can't just—" "Richard is downstairs," Marco cut her off. "I am offering you a cage with a key, Evelyn. He offers you a grave. Choose." She looked at his hand. It was a deal with the devil. She knew it. If she took his hand, she was stepping into a world of violence and shadows she didn't understand. But she remembered the bruise on her wrist. She remembered Richard's cold eyes. Slowly, tremulously, Evelyn reached out and placed her hand in Marco's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and engulfing. He pulled her to her feet, not roughly, but with a firmness that told her she was no longer in charge of her own destiny. "Good girl," he murmured. He led her toward a hidden panel in the wall that slid open to reveal a private elevator. As the doors closed, shutting out the lounge and the hallway where her past lurked, Evelyn looked at the man beside her. Marco Bianchi stared straight ahead, his profile sharp and unyielding. She had escaped a wolf, only to be claimed by a lion. And as the elevator began its smooth ascent toward the clouds, Evelyn realized the most terrifying part of all. She liked the way his hand felt holding hers. The ascent in the private elevator was a vacuum of silence, smooth and unnervingly fast, as if the machine itself was eager to deposit Evelyn into a world she was ill-equipped to navigate. She stood with her back pressed against the brushed steel wall, her clutch held like a shield against her chest, watching the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher until they bypassed the guest suites entirely. Marco Bianchi stood in the center of the car, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, radiating a calm that was far more terrifying than Richard's explosive temper. He did not look at her, yet his presence filled the confined space, heavy and suffocating like the scent of ozone before a storm. Every time the elevator chimed, passing another 10 floors, Evelyn felt the tether to her old life snapping, strand by strand, leaving her adrift in the orbit of a man who commanded the city from the shadows. When the doors finally slid open, they did not reveal a hotel corridor, but a sprawling, open-concept penthouse that seemed to float above the clouds. The space was a testament to cold, hard power. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a dizzying 360-degree view of the city, turning the millions of lights below into a carpet of diamonds laid out for Marco's amusement. The floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the moonlight, and the furniture was stark, modern Italian leather in shades of charcoal and slate. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it lacked the warmth of a home. It felt like a fortress, a high-altitude command center designed for a man who spent his life looking down on the ants scurrying beneath him. "Welcome home," Marco said, the irony in his voice dry and dark as he stepped out, his dress shoes clicking sharply on the black stone. He didn't wait for her, moving with the fluid grace of a jungle cat entering its territory, unbuttoning his suit jacket as he walked toward a massive wet bar made of backlit onyx. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, the elevator doors attempting to close on her before she stuck her hand out to stop them. The sensor beeped, and she stepped into the room, the air conditioning raising gooseflesh on her bare arms. "This isn't my home," she said, her voice sounding thin in the cavernous space. "I can't stay here, Marco. I appreciate what you did downstairs. Truly, you saved me, but I can't just vanish. I have a life. I have a job." Marco poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher, ignoring the alcohol this time, and turned to face her, leaning his hip against the bar. The city lights haloed his silhouette, casting his face in shadow, making his icy blue eyes burn brighter. "You have a job as a junior graphic designer at a firm that Richard's father holds shares in," he stated, the knowledge dropping between them like a guillotine blade. "You have a lease on an apartment that Richard has a key to, despite you changing the locks twice. And you have a bank account that I suspect is currently being flagged for suspicious activity, freezing your access to funds." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her grip on her clutch tightening until her knuckles turned white. How do you know that?" "I know everything that happens in my city," Marco replied, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "While we were in the elevator, my head of security ran a background check on you, and Richard Vane. It's amazing what digital footprints people leave behind when they're desperate." He took a slow sip of water, watching her over the rim of the glass. "You don't have a life, Evelyn. You have a trap, and you were running in circles inside it until you stumbled into me." "So what is this then?" she demanded, gesturing around the opulent, cold room. A spark of anger flared in her chest, overriding the fear. She was tired of men controlling her, tired of being a pawn on someone else's board. "Is this just a bigger trap, a prettier cage?" Marco set the glass down and walked toward her, closing the distance until he towered over her. The air between them crackled with tension, a magnetic pull that made her want to run and stay all at once. He reached out, his hand large and warm, and this time he didn't touch her face. Instead, he reached for her clutch. She resisted for a moment, a tug-of-war of wills, before his superior strength won out and he gently pried it from her fingers. He opened it, extracted her cell phone, and dropped the bag onto a nearby chair. "It's a fortress," he corrected, looking down at her phone screen which was lighting up with a barrage of texts from Richard. He didn't read them. He simply held the power button until the screen went black. "And right now, the drawbridge is up. Richard is currently packing the lobby of the Obsidian Tower, harassing my concierge and threatening to call the police. If you leave now, you walk straight into his arms. Is that what you want?" "No," she whispered, the fight draining out of her legs. She swayed slightly, the exhaustion of the adrenaline crash hitting her. "But I can't stay here with you. I don't even know you." "You know enough," Marco said, slipping her phone into his pocket. "You know I stopped him. You know I didn't hurt you when I could have. And you know that right now I am the only thing standing between you and a hospital bed." He placed a hand on the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk of her dress, guiding her further into the room. "You're exhausted. You're shaking. Go to the guest suite down the hall, second door on the left. There's a robe. Shower. Wash the scent of fear off your skin. I'll have food sent up." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive, issued with the effortless command of a CEO used to having his orders executed immediately. Evelyn looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but found only a stony resolve. He wasn't looking at her like a conquest. He was looking at her like a problem he had decided to solve. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." Marco's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark and ancient passing behind his eyes. He looked at his hand, the one that was currently resting on her back, as if surprised by his own actions. "Let's just say I have a distaste for bullies," he murmured, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had captivated her in the lounge. "And perhaps I'm possessive of things that fall into my lap." He gently pushed her toward the hallway. "Go, before I change my mind and throw you out to the wolves." Evelyn went. She walked down the long, art-lined corridor, feeling his gaze burning into her back until she turned the corner. The guest suite was larger than her entire apartment, decorated in the same minimalist luxury as the main room, with a bathroom that featured a rainfall shower big enough for 4 people. She stripped off the green dress, letting it pool on the floor like a shed skin, and stepped under the scalding water. As the heat hit her tense muscles, she leaned her forehead against the cool tile and wept, silent, racking sobs that shook her frame. She cried for the fear, for the humiliation of Richard's pursuit, and for the terrifying realization that she had just traded a known devil for an unknown god. When she emerged 20 minutes later, wrapped in a plush charcoal robe that swallowed her petite frame, she felt scrubbed raw but strangely steady. She found Marco in the kitchen area of the penthouse, which looked as though it had never been used for actual cooking. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. A faint, jagged scar ran from his left wrist up toward his elbow, a brutal reminder that his life in the boardroom was only half the story. He was plating food from takeout containers that smelled divine, truffle risotto and seared scallops. He looked up as she entered, his eyes sweeping over her damp hair and the oversized robe. For a second, the mask of the detached CEO slipped, and she saw raw male appreciation, heavy and intense, before he blinked it away. "Eat," he said, sliding a plate across the marble island toward a high-backed leather stool. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." He wasn't wrong. The stress of the last month with Richard had made eating a chore she often skipped. Evelyn climbed onto the stool, the scent of the food making her stomach growl audibly. Marco poured himself a glass of deep red wine and leaned against the counter opposite her, watching her eat with a predatory patience. "Thank you," she managed between bites, the rich flavors exploding on her tongue. "Don't thank me yet," Marco said, swirling the wine in his glass. "I expect payment." Evelyn froze, the fork halfway to her mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lowered the fork slowly, her eyes wide. What? What kind of payment?" Marco let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any real humor. "Relax, Tesoro, I don't barter for flesh, that's beneath me." He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "The payment is the truth, the full truth. You told me Richard is your ex. You told me he's abusive, but men like Richard Vane don't chase women into high-security buildings just because of a breakup." He looked desperate downstairs, not just angry, scared. "Why?" Evelyn set her fork down, her appetite vanishing. She wrapped her hands around herself, pulling the robe tighter. I found something," she admitted, her voice trembling. "On his laptop. I was looking for proof that he was cheating. I wanted a reason to leave that he couldn't argue with, but I found spreadsheets, weird accounts, names I didn't recognize." Marco's posture changed instantly. He went from relaxed observer to alert hunter. He set his wine glass down. "What kind of names?" "I don't remember all of them," she said, shrinking under his intensity. "There was a company, Red Star Shipping, and a name that kept coming up, Morty." The air in the room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marco's face hardened into a mask of pure granite. The playful, dark charm vanished, replaced by the cold lethality of the Mafia Don. "Morty," he repeated, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. Is that bad?" Evelyn asked, terrified by his reaction. Marco didn't answer her immediately. He pushed off the counter and walked to the wall of windows, looking out at the city he claimed to own. But tonight, looking at him, Evelyn realized he didn't just own it. He was at war for it. "Richard Vane isn't just a rich kid with a temper," Marco said, his back to her. "He's a launderer, a bottom feeder moving money for the Morty crime family, my rivals." He turned around slowly, and the look in his eyes made Evelyn want to hide. It wasn't anger directed at her, but the sheer weight of the violence he carried. "You didn't just break up with a bad boyfriend, Evelyn. You stole secrets from a syndicate that kills people for looking at them the wrong way. That's why he's desperate. If he doesn't get you back and silence you, the Mortys will think he's compromised. They'll kill him, and they'll certainly kill you." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun. I didn't know, I just wanted to leave." "Ignorance is not a shield in my world," Marco said coldly. He walked back to her, placing his hands on the counter, leaning in until they were nose to nose. "You are in the middle of a war now. Richard is the least of your problems. The Mortys are distinctively lacking in mercy." "Then I have to go to the police," she stammered, sliding off the stool. "I have to." "The police," Marco laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Half the precinct is on Morty's payroll and the other half is on mine. You walk into a station and you'll be dead within the hour." He walked around the island, trapping her between the marble and his body. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. "You have two choices, Evelyn. You can walk out that door, try your luck with the police, or run to another city, in which case you will be found in a ditch within the week. Or," he paused, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes, "you stay here, you belong to me. You let me handle Richard. You let me handle the Mortys." "Belong to you," she whispered, the words sounding both terrified and thrilling. "What does that mean?" "It means you do exactly what I say," Marco replied, his voice low and rough. "It means you don't leave this penthouse without me. It means you give me everything, your trust, your fear, your loyalty. In exchange, I give you the only thing that matters." "What's that?" "Life," Marco said, "and the promise that anyone who tries to touch you will have to burn through me first." A phone rang, shattering the moment. It wasn't Evelyn's, it was Marco's. He pulled a sleek, encrypted device from his pocket and answered it, his eyes never leaving hers. "Speak," he commanded into the phone. There was a pause as he listened to the voice on the other end. Evelyn watched the transformation happen in real time. The CEO vanished completely, and the Don took over. His jaw set, His eyes darkened to the color of the midnight sea. "If he's still in the lobby," Marco said, his voice devoid of all humanity, "break his fingers, 2 of them, the left hand, then toss him on the street. Tell him if he comes back to the obsidian, he loses the hand." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Marco ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. The violence of his order hung in the air, grotesque and undeniable. You just ordered." She couldn't even finish the sentence. "I told you," Marco said, his voice calm, contrasting the brutality of his words. "I protect what is mine. He was threatening my staff. He was waiting for you. Now he has other things to worry about." He reached out, cupping her face in his large hand. His thumb brushed over her bottom lip, dragging it down slightly. Evelyn trembled, not just from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that this monster was the only thing standing between her and death. And God help her, the power radiating off him was intoxicating. "You think I'm a monster," he murmured, reading the conflict in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered honestly. "Good," Marco said, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "You need a monster. A prince cannot save you from the Mortys, Evelyn. Only a devil can fight a devil." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers for a sign of rejection. But she didn't pull away. She stood there, wrapped in his robe, in his kitchen, in his world. "I'm staying," she said, the decision solidifying in her chest. It wasn't surrender, it was survival. And maybe, just maybe, it was something else, a pull toward the darkness that she had never felt before. Marco nodded, a look of grim satisfaction settling on his features. "Then go to bed, Piccola. Tomorrow we don't just hide. Tomorrow I start burning down the weeds to clear a path for you." He turned and walked toward the study, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a finality that echoed in the silent apartment. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, the taste of truffle and wine still on her tongue, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin. She walked to the window and looked down at the city. Somewhere down there, Richard was in pain because Marco had willed it. She touched the glass, her reflection staring back. A woman on the run, now the captive guest of the most dangerous man in the city. She should have been terrified. She was terrified. But as she watched the city lights flicker, she felt a strange, dark thrill curl in her stomach. She was safe, and for the first time in her life, the monster was on her side. The morning sun that flooded the penthouse bedroom was not the warm, welcoming light of a new beginning, but a harsh, blinding interrogation that exposed every dust mote dancing in the air and every lingering shadow in the corners of the room. Evelyn woke with a gasp, her body jerking upright in the massive bed, her sheets tangled around her legs like the remnants of a fever dream. For a heartbeat, she didn't know where she was. The scent of the room was wrong, too clean, too masculine, lacking the stale smell of damp that permeated her old apartment, and the silence was absolute. Then the memories of the previous night crashed over her like a tidal wave. The lounge, the impulsive decision to sit on a stranger's lap, the revelation of Marco Bianch's true nature, and the terrifying knowledge that Richard was somewhere in the city with broken fingers and a vendetta. She climbed out of bed, her legs feeling unsteady, and padded across the cold obsidian floor to the ensuite bathroom. The face staring back at her in the mirror was pale and drawn, with dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes, but there was a clarity in her gaze that hadn't been there in months. She washed her face with cold water, the shock of it grounding her, and dressed in the clothes that had been left for her on the vanity, a sleek, tailored charcoal dress that was clearly expensive and perfectly sized. It was another reminder of Marco's reach. He hadn't just protected her, he had measured her, analyzed her, and provided for her while she slept, a level of control that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. When she walked out into the main living area, she found Marco standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, talking quietly into his phone. He was dressed in a navy three-piece suit that fit him like a second skin, his posture rigid and commanding. He sensed her presence before he saw her, ending the call abruptly and turning to face her. The look in his eyes was unreadable, a wall of blue ice that kept the world at bay, but as his gaze swept over her, the ice seemed to crack, revealing a flicker of heat that made her breath hitch. "The dress fits," he observed, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the cavernous room. He walked toward her, not rushing, but moving with the inevitable momentum of a glacier. I had my assistant pull a few options based on your measurements. Evelyn felt a flush rise to her cheeks, not just from the implication of him knowing her size, but from the memory of his hands on her waist the night before. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Thank you, but Marco, I can't just play dress-up. I have to go to work. I have to figure out what Richard is doing. Marco stopped a few feet from her, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, his hand moving toward her face, likely to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. It was a simple, intimate gesture, but Evelyn's body betrayed her. Before her mind could register his intent, her muscle memory took over. She flinched violently, jerking her head back and raising her shoulder in a defensive posture, her eyes squeezing shut in anticipation of a blow. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn slowly opened her eyes, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Marco hadn't moved. His hand was still suspended in the air, inches from where her face had been, but his expression had shattered. The cold, arrogant mask was gone, replaced by a look of raw, unadulterated fury mixed with something that looked painfully like regret. He slowly lowered his hand, curling it into a fist at his side so tight that his knuckles turned white. He did that to you, Marco said, his voice terrifyingly soft. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, spoken with the quiet intensity of a death sentence. I'm sorry, Evelyn whispered, shame burning through her. She hated that she was broken, hated that she reacted like a frightened animal. I didn't mean to. It's just reflex. Do not apologize, Marco commanded, stepping closer, though he kept his hands deliberately at his sides this time, respecting the invisible barrier her fear had erected. You do not apologize for the scars someone else carved into you. But understand this, Evelyn. My hands are capable of great violence, yes. I have done things that would make you scream, but I would cut them off at the wrists before I ever raised one against you. The intensity of his promise hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn looked up at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. He was a killer, a criminal, a monster to the outside world, but looking at him now, she believed him completely. He was a monster who would burn the world down to keep her warm. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I trust you, it's just hard to forget. We aren't staying here today, Marco said abruptly, shifting gears as if the moment of vulnerability was too much to sustain. I have business at the tower, legitimate business. You're coming with me. I'm not leaving you here alone with your thoughts, and I certainly don't trust the security of this building if Richard decides to get creative. The ride to the Bianchi Enterprises headquarters was a blur of tinted windows and armored SUVs. Marco didn't take her to the main entrance. They entered through a private underground garage that led directly to his executive suite on the top floor. His office was a reflection of the man himself. Stark, imposing, and impeccably organized, with a view of the city that rivaled the penthouse. He settled her on a leather sofa in the corner with a tablet and a cup of espresso, then went to his massive desk to work. For hours, she watched him. She saw the CEO in action, fielding calls in 3 different languages, signing documents with a flourish, dismissing executives with a single look. But she also saw the other side. She saw the way his eyes constantly darted to where she sat, checking on her, making sure she was still there. She saw the way he tensed every time his private line rang. Around midday, Marco dismissed his secretary and locked the office door. He walked over to the wet bar in the corner, poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, and sat down on the sofa next to her, loosening his tie. He looked tired, the weight of his double life pressing down on him. You asked me last night why I helped you, Marco said, staring into his glass as the bubbles rose to the surface. Why I didn't just throw you out. You said you didn't like bullies, Evelyn replied, setting her tablet aside. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. He took a sip, his jaw working as he swallowed. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a crack in the foundation of the invincible Dawn. 10 years ago, I wasn't the CEO. I was just the underboss. I had a wife. Her name was Sophia. She was like you, gentle, soft, the kind of woman who picked up spiders to put them outside instead of killing them. Evelyn stayed silent, sensing that he was offering her a piece of his soul, a rare currency for a man like him. "I thought I could keep my worlds separate," he continued, his voice growing rougher. "I thought if I didn't bring work home, if I kept her in the dark, she would be safe. I was arrogant. The Morty family, the same ones Richard works for, they didn't care about my rules. They wanted to send a message to my father." He paused, his grip on the glass tightening until she thought it might shatter. "They rigged her car. I was supposed to be driving it, but she took it to go to the market." I heard the explosion from the living room. Evelyn gasped, her hand instinctively reaching out to cover his. "Marco, I'm so sorry." He looked down at her hand covering his, staring at the contact as if it were alien. "I became this." He gestured to the cold room, the expensive suit, the hard lines of his face, "because the man I was before wasn't strong enough to save her. I turned my heart into stone so it couldn't be broken again. I built this empire not just for power, but for control. Absolute, total control. Because when you lose control, people die." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. His skin was rough, calloused from years of violence, contrasting with her softness. "When you ran into that lounge, when you sat on my lap, you didn't just ask for help. You looked at me with eyes that were terrified, yet you trusted me enough to touch me. It woke something up that I thought was dead. I saw her in you, Evelyn. Not her face, but her spirit. And the thought of another man extinguishing that light. It made me want to burn the city to the ground." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't just lust or possessiveness, it was redemption. He was saving her to save himself. "I'm not Sophia," she whispered. "No," Marco agreed, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "You are Evelyn, and you are alive, and I intend to keep you that way." The intimacy of the moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the door. Marco didn't pull away immediately. He lingered for a second longer, inhaling her scent, before the mask slammed back into place. He stood up, released her hand, and called out, "Enter." The door opened, and a man walked in who looked like he was carved from the same stone as Marco, though rougher around the edges. This was Luca, Marco's second-in-command, a man with a scar running through his lip and eyes that had seen too much war. He held a tablet in his hand, and his expression was grim. "Boss," Luca said, nodding respectfully to Evelyn but keeping his focus on Marco. "We have a problem. The rat didn't just go to the hospital." Marco walked back to his desk, leaning against the edge of it, his arms crossed. "Speak." "Richard Vane has been busy," Luca said, sliding the tablet across the mahogany surface. "He didn't go to the police. He went to his father's lawyers, and he went to his handlers at Red Star. As of an hour ago, Miss Evelyn's bank accounts have been frozen under suspicion of embezzlement. They're claiming she transferred company funds before she ran." "What?" Evelyn shot up from the sofa, horror flooding her veins. "That's a lie. I never touched their money." "It doesn't matter if it's true," Marco said coldly, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. "It only matters that they filed the paperwork. It freezes your assets. It makes you a fugitive." "It gets worse," Luca added, his voice lowering. "He's petitioning for an emergency psychiatric hold, claiming she's unstable, a danger to herself, and he's leveraging the lease on her mother's apartment. The building is owned by a shell company linked to Vane. He sent an eviction notice this morning, effective immediately." Evelyn felt the room spin. Her mother, her sick mother who had nothing to do with this, who relied on that apartment for its proximity to the dialysis center. Richard knew exactly where to strike to hurt her the most. He wasn't just attacking her, he was dismantling her entire existence. "He's going to hurt her," Evelyn choked out, panic rising in her throat like bile. "He knows I'll come back if he hurts her. I have to go to her." She started for the door, blind with terror, but Marco was there in an instant, blocking her path. He didn't grab her, he simply stood there, a wall of solid muscle and resolve. "Move, Marco," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, it's my mom." "If you walk out that door," Marco said, his voice calm but hard as steel, "Richard wins. He is waiting for you to panic. He wants you to run to her so he can grab you. And once he has you, Evelyn, he will disappear you, and your mother will still be evicted." "Then what do I do?" she screamed, pounding her fists against his chest. I can't just sit here drinking sparkling water while he destroys my family. Marco caught her wrists, holding them firmly against his chest, forcing her to look at him. You don't do anything, he said, his blue eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. You let me be the monster. He looked over her head at Luca. Where is Vane now? He's at the Red Star warehouse in the shipping district, Luca replied. Meeting with the Morty Capo. They think they have us cornered. They think because we're legitimate now, we won't strike back in daylight. Marco released Evelyn's wrists and cupped her face, wiping away a tear with his thumb. The tenderness was jarring against the violence of his words. He thinks he can use the law against you because he thinks I play by the rules. He thinks I'm a CEO who worries about stock prices and public opinion. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. He forgot who I was before I put on the suit. Marco stepped back and turned to Luca. Get the car, not the SUV, the black sedan, and call the boys. I want the cleanup crew on standby at her mother's building to ensure no eviction takes place. Buy the building if you have to, just secure it. And Vane? Luca asked, a dark smile touching his lips. Marco walked to a hidden panel behind his desk. He pressed his palm against the wood, and it clicked open, revealing a safe. He spun the dial and pulled out a heavy, matte black pistol, checking the chamber with a practiced, chilling efficiency. He tucked it into the holster at the small of his back, beneath his tailored jacket. Vane wants a war, Marco said, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper that had turned Evelyn's world upside down. He wants to involve family. Fine, we're done hiding. We're done playing defense. He walked back to Evelyn, who stood frozen in the center of the room, watching the transformation complete. The businessman was gone. The grieving widower was gone. Standing before her was the Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses, a man who dealt in death as easily as he dealt in currency. You stay here with Luca's men, Marco commanded. They will guard this door with their lives. Do not leave. Do not answer the phone. Where are you going? She whispered, terrified for him, terrified of him. Marco adjusted his cuffs, his face set in stone. I'm going to remind the Mortys why they used to be afraid to say my name. He turned and walked out the door, the air in the room seeming to rush out with him, leaving Evelyn standing in the silence of the executive suite. She walked to the window and looked down at the streets below, imagining Richard's smirk, imagining her mother's fear. And then she looked at the reflection of the office behind her, Marco's sanctuary. She realized then that the cage wasn't to keep her in. It was to keep the war out. But the war had breached the walls, and Marco Bianchi had just walked out to meet it, not with a lawsuit, but with a gun. The price of her safety was his soul, and as she watched the black sedan peel out of the garage below, she knew that whether he came back covered in blood or didn't come back at all, she was irrevocably, dangerously in love with the devil. The hours Evelyn spent waiting in the executive suite were a slow torture of ticking clocks and rising shadows. The city outside transformed from a bustling gray metropolis into a glittering grid of electric amber, but inside the office, the air remained heavy with the ghost of Marco's departure. When the heavy oak door finally clicked open just past 9 o'clock, Evelyn jolted upright on the sofa, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Marco entered alone. He looked weary, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the weight of carrying a kingdom. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms that were tense and vascular. But what stopped Evelyn's breath was the faint, metallic scent that clung to him, the smell of ozone, copper, and spent gunpowder. He didn't speak immediately. He walked straight to the wet bar, poured a glass of whiskey with a hand that was perfectly steady, and downed it in one swallow. Then he turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide, stripping away the civilized veneer he wore for the world. He looked raw, dangerous, and utterly relieved to see her sitting exactly where he had left her. "It is done," he said, his voice a rough gravel that scraped against the silence. "Your mother's building is now the property of a holding company under my personal protection. The eviction notice has been rescinded. I have placed 2 men in the lobby and 1 on her floor. Richard Vane will not get within a mile of her without facing a firing squad. The relief that washed over Evelyn was so profound it made her knees weak. She stood up, crossing the room toward him, ignoring the danger signals radiating off him like heat from a furnace. "And Richard?" she asked, stopping a foot away, searching his face for bruises, for blood, for anything that would tell her what he had done. "Richard is reevaluating his life choices," Marco replied cryptically, stepping into her space until his thighs brushed against her dress. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind her ear. "I made it clear to his handlers that he is a liability. The Mortys are businessmen, Evelyn. Ruthless, yes, but pragmatic. They don't like messy associates who draw the wrong kind of attention. Richard is currently in hiding, likely terrified of his own shadow." "Thank you," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "You saved us." "I didn't do it for gratitude," Marco murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. The intensity in his eyes shifted, darkening into a hunger that made the air in the room thick and difficult to breathe. "I did it because you are mine. I told you, Evelyn, I protect what belongs to me." The declaration hung between them, heavy and absolute. Evelyn looked up at him, at the sharp line of his jaw and the scar that bisected his eyebrow, and realized she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't want to be safe in a generic way. She wanted to be consumed by this specific fire. The fear she had felt in the lounge the night before had transmuted into something else entirely, a desperate need to be close to the only man who could make the world stop spinning. "Then show me," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with anticipation. "Show me that I'm yours." Marco didn't need to be asked twice. He groaned, a low, primal sound that vibrated in his chest, and swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her not to the sofa, but through the side door into the private sleeping quarters attached to the office, a room she hadn't even known existed, sparse and functional, dominated by a large bed. He set her down on the mattress and followed her down, his body a heavy, comforting weight that pressed the breath from her lungs. Their union was not gentle. It was a collision of desperate souls. Marco kissed her with a possessive fervor, claiming her mouth, her breath, her very size. His hands were everywhere, worshipping her curves, tracing the lines of her body with a reverence that bordered on religious. For Evelyn, it was an exorcism. Every touch of his rough hands erased the phantom memories of Richard's cruelty. Marco didn't take, he gave. He gave her his strength, his protection, and his vulnerability. When they finally moved together, skin against skin in the dim light of the city, it felt less like an act of pleasure and more like the signing of a blood oath. She cried out his name, arching into him, and in that moment of shattering release, she knew there was no going back. She had tied herself to the storm. Hours later, they lay tangled in the sheets, the city lights casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Marco held her against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist, his breathing slow and deep. Evelyn traced the scar on his forearm with her fingertip, feeling the steady thrum of his heart beneath her ear. "We cannot hide in this room forever," Marco said into the darkness, his voice returning to its usual calm command. "Tomorrow night is the Sapphire Gala. It's the biggest charity event of the season. Every power player in the city will be there. Politicians, judges, and the Mortys." Evelyn stiffened, her hand pausing on his arm. "You want to go, with them there?" "I have to go," Marco corrected, tightening his hold on her. "Absence shows weakness. If I don't show my face, they will think I am hunkering down, preparing for a siege. They will think they have rattled me. I need to walk into that ballroom and look the Morty dawn in the eye and smile. I need to show them that I am untouchable." He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. His face was serious, the lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. "And I want you to come with me." "Me," Evelyn breathed, panic fluttering in her chest. "But Richard, if he's connected to them." "Richard is a pawn," Marco said dismissively. "He won't be allowed within 500 feet of the gala, but bringing you, it sends a message. It tells them that I am not hiding you. It tells them that you are under the personal protection of the Capo dei Capi. It is a declaration of war, Evelyn, wrapped in silk and champagne. If you walk in on my arm, no one will dare touch you. To touch you would be to sign their own death warrant in front of 500 witnesses." "It sounds dangerous," she whispered, looking into his icy blue eyes. "It is," he admitted, never lying to her. "But it is safer than leaving you in a fortress while I am away. Beside me, you are in the eye of the hurricane. The danger is all around, but in the center it is calm. Will you do this? Will you stand with me?" Evelyn looked at the man who had just dismantled her enemies and worshipped her body. She saw the fear behind his request, the fear of losing her, the fear of failing her as he had failed his wife. She reached up, cupping his cheek. "I'll go," she said softly. "I'm not afraid, not with you." The Sapphire Gala was an event of suffocating opulence held at the Grand Dominion Hotel. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and glittering jewels, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of polite, treacherous conversation. Evelyn wore a gown of midnight blue silk that Marco had commissioned for her, a dress that clung to her curves like liquid night, with a slit that rose high on her thigh and a back that plunged dangerously low. Around her neck hung a diamond pendant that felt heavy and cold, a silent statement of Marco's wealth and claim. She walked into the ballroom with her hand tucked into the crook of Marco's arm, her head held high despite the trembling in her legs. The room seemed to quiet as they entered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a breeze through dry grass. Marco looked devastating in a tuxedo, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. He nodded to associates, smiled coldly at rivals, and kept Evelyn tucked firmly against his side, his body a solid wall between her and the world. "Keep your eyes on me," Marco whispered against her ear as he guided her through the throng. "Do not look at them. They are sharks. If they see fear, they circle." "I see them," she whispered back, spotting a group of men in the corner who were watching them with predatory stillness. "Are those the Mortys?" "The one in the gray suit is Giovanni Morty," Marco murmured, his grip on her arm tightening imperceptibly. "Don't stare. He is old, but he still has teeth." They moved through the evening like dancers on a blade's edge. Marco introduced her simply as Evelyn, offering no last name, no explanation. His possessiveness was palpable. He glared at any man who let his gaze linger on her too long. Yet, despite the tension, there was a thrill to it. For the first time, Evelyn felt powerful. She wasn't the victim running from an abusive ex. She was the consort of a king, untouchable and revered. When the orchestra began a slow waltz, Marco pulled her onto the dance floor. He held her close, his hand splayed across the bare skin of her back, his eyes locking onto hers. For a few minutes, the room fell away. The danger, the politics, the Mortys, it all faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of his body and the promise in his eyes. "You are breathtaking," Marco said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tonight, I realized something. I cannot just protect you, Evelyn. I cannot just keep you in a cage, even a gilded one. I want a life with you, a real life. When this is done, when Morty is handled, I want to take you to Lake Como. I have a villa there. No guards, no guns, just us." "That sounds like a dream," she said, smiling up at him, her heart swelling with hope. "It's a promise," he vowed, leaning down to brush his lips against hers. "I will dismantle them piece by piece until the threat is gone, and then you and I are going to disappear." The moment was shattered by a tap on Marco's shoulder. Evelyn flinched, but Marco didn't jump. He turned slowly, his expression hardening into a mask of annoyance. It was Luca, his second in command, looking pale and urgent. "Boss," Luca said, his voice low. "Giovanni is asking for a sit-down, now, in the private lounge upstairs. He says he wants to discuss a truce regarding the shipping lanes." Marco's eyes narrowed. "Here, now." "He says it can't wait. He claims he has information about a third party interfering. He's offering a ceasefire." Marco looked at Evelyn, conflict warring in his eyes. A ceasefire could mean the end of the war. It could mean her safety without bloodshed. But leaving her alone, even for a moment, went against every instinct he possessed. "Go," Evelyn said, squeezing his hand. "If it stops the fighting, you have to hear him out. I'll stay right here. I'll stand with Luca's men." Marco hesitated, scanning the room. The ballroom was crowded, well-lit, and he had 6 armed security guards perimetering the dance floor. "Luca, stay with her," Marco commanded, his voice leaving no room for error. "Do not take your eyes off her. If anyone approaches, you put a bullet in them. I don't care who it is." Understood, boss, Luca said, stepping closer to Evelyn. I will be 10 minutes, Marco promised, kissing her forehead. Do not move from this spot. He turned and strode away, disappearing into the crowd toward the private elevators. Evelyn watched him go, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She stood by the edge of the dance floor, Luca standing rigid beside her like a statue. 5 minutes passed. The orchestra switched to a faster tempo. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, stumbling slightly. A glass shattered on the floor, creating a small commotion. Luca's eyes darted toward the noise, a split-second distraction. In that second, a hand clamped over Evelyn's mouth from behind. It wasn't a rough grab. It was precise, professional, and terrifyingly strong. Before she could scream, a needle pricked the side of her neck. The world tilted violently. Her vision blurred, the lights of the chandelier smearing into long streaks of gold. She tried to reach for Luca, but her arms felt like lead. She slumped backward, caught by strong arms that held her upright, making it look like she had simply fainted. Easy now, darling, a voice whispered in her ear. It wasn't Richard. It was deeper, colder. Don't make a scene. She heard Luca shout, a distant, muffled sound like he was underwater. Boss, secure the... Then there was the sound of a suppressed gunshot, a soft phut, and the sound of a body hitting the floor. The crowd screamed. Chaos erupted. But Evelyn was already being dragged backward, through a service door that had been propped open, into the cold, dark hallway behind the ballroom. She fought to keep her eyes open, to fight back, but the drug was pulling her down into the abyss. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her completely was the face of the man dragging her, a man with a scar on his chin, wearing the uniform of the hotel security. A traitor. And then she was gone. Upstairs, in the private lounge, Marco stared at the empty chair where Giovanni Morty was supposed to be. The room was empty. A single note lay on the table. You looked away. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It was a decoy, a trap, not to kill him but to separate him. The sound of chaos from the ballroom floor drifted up through the floorboards. Marco didn't take the elevator. He ran. He burst through the stairwell doors, descending the flights of stairs 3 at a time, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. He burst into the ballroom, his gun drawn, ignoring the screaming civilians diving for cover. He saw the gap in the crowd near the orchestra. He saw the shattered champagne glass. And he saw Luca lying on the marble floor, blood pooling around his head, his eyes staring unseeingly at the ceiling. Evelyn was gone. Marco stood frozen in the center of the pandemonium, the noise of the room fading into a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He looked at the spot where he had left her, where he had promised her safety, where he had promised her a future. All that remained was her silver clutch, lying abandoned on the floor, crushed under the stampede of fleeing guests. He walked over and picked it up. The metal was cold against his palm. A rage, pure and black and bottomless, opened up inside him. The CEO died in that moment. The man who wanted a villa in Lake Como died. The only thing left was the monster, the thing the city feared, the thing that lived in the dark. He pulled out his phone, his hand steady with the unnatural calm of a sociopath. He dialed a number that hadn't been used in 5 years. Burn it, Marco said into the phone, his voice devoid of humanity. Burn it all, close the bridges, shut down the airports, ground every flight. If a car leaves this city tonight without my permission, blow it off the road. Boss, the voice on the other end hesitated, terrified. The police, the fallout. I don't care about the police, Marco roared, the sound echoing through the ruined ballroom like the call of a beast. They took her. I want every Morty associate, every runner, every launderer found and brought to the warehouse. I want the streets to run red until I find her. He looked at the clutch in his hand, his knuckles turning white. Richard thought he was starting a war, Marco whispered to the empty air, his eyes burning with blue fire. He didn't start a war, he started the apocalypse. He turned and walked out of the ballroom, stepping over the wreckage, a man on a path of total annihilation. He would find her, or he would leave nothing of this city but ash. The smell of brine and rusting iron was the first thing to assault Evelyn's senses as consciousness clawed its way back into her mind. The drug from the gala had left her head feeling heavy, stuffed with cotton, and her limbs felt detached, as if they belonged to someone else. She blinked her eyes open, the harsh glare of a swinging halogen bulb stinging her retinas. She was seated in a metal chair, her wrists zip-tied painfully tight behind her back, her ankles bound to the chair legs. The room was vast and echoing, a shipping container or a warehouse, the air thick with the damp chill of the harbor. "She's awake." The voice was familiar, but it lacked the smooth, arrogant cadence she remembered. It was shrill, laced with panic. Evelyn turned her head, fighting the nausea that rolled in her stomach, and saw Richard. He looked terrible. His tuxedo from the gala was disheveled, the tie missing, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was packing back and forth in front of her, wringing his hands, looking less like a captor and more like a trapped animal. Standing in the shadows behind him were three men she didn't recognize, heavy-set, grim-faced soldiers with tattoos creeping up their necks. They weren't Richard's friends, they were his keepers. This was the Morty crew. "Water," Evelyn croaked, her throat parched. Richard stopped packing and looked at her. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the old Richard, the sneer, the contempt. He walked over and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "You shouldn't have run, Evie. You shouldn't have gone to him. Do you have any idea what you've done? You started a war." "You started it," she whispered, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "You couldn't let me go." "I was protecting my investment," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. He gestured wildly to the men in the shadows. "And now look, the whole city is on lockdown. Marco has closed the bridges. He's burning down safe houses. He's insane, Evelyn. He's not a CEO, he's a butcher." "He's coming for me," Evelyn said. She didn't say it as a threat, she said it as a certainty. She felt it in her marrow. Marco wasn't just coming, he was inevitable. One of the men in the shadows stepped forward. He was older, with silver hair and a face like a roadmap of violence. This was likely a capo. He looked at Richard with undisguised disgust. "Shut up, Vane," the capo spat. "Your whining is giving me a headache. We used you to lure Bianchi out. Now that we have the girl, you are becoming expensive." Richard's eyes went wide. "We had a deal. I deliver her, you get your leverage, and I get my clean slate." "Plans change," the capo said, lighting a cigarette. "Bianchi isn't negotiating. He's not answering our calls for ransom. He's just killing everyone who knows where this warehouse is. He killed my brother an hour ago in the meatpacking district. He isn't playing by the rules." The capo turned his cold, dead eyes onto Evelyn. "He doesn't want you back, girl. He wants revenge. And when he gets here, he's going to find nothing but ashes." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in Evelyn's brain. They were going to kill her. She wasn't leverage anymore, she was loose end. She struggled against the zip ties, the plastic biting into her skin, but it was useless. Suddenly, the warehouse lights flickered. A low, vibrating hum resonated through the metal floor, followed by a sound that made the blood freeze in Evelyn's veins. The distant, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy-caliber machine gun, silenced but unmistakable. The capo dropped his cigarette. "Positions," he roared, pulling a handgun from his jacket. "He's here." The three guards scattered, taking cover behind crates and rusted machinery. Richard, paralyzed by terror, scrambled backward, cowering behind a stack of pallets near Evelyn. "He found us," Richard whimpered, clutching his head. "How did he find us?" The answer came in the form of the main, warehouse doors exploding inward. It wasn't a tactical breach, it was a demolition. A massive armored truck rammed through the corrugated metal, sending shrapnel flying like confetti. Smoke billowed into the cavernous space, obscuring the entrance. The Morty men opened fire, their bullets sparking harmlessly against the truck's plating. Then the shadows moved. Figures clad in tactical black gear repelled from the skylights, shattering the glass high above. They moved with the synchronized lethality of a wolf pack. Gunfire erupted, deafening and chaotic. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, curling her body as best she could in the chair as bullets whizzed through the air. She heard a scream, one of the Morty guards falling, then another. The gunfire from the defenders was sporadic, desperate. The return fire was surgical. Clear left, clear right. The voices were sharp, professional. And then, through the smoke and the smell of cordite, a figure emerged from the armored truck. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a tuxedo, the jacket torn, the white shirt stained with blood that wasn't his. He held a silver handgun in each hand, walking through the firefight with the terrifying calmness of a man who cannot die. Marco. He saw her instantly. His eyes, glowing like blue embers in the gloom, locked onto her form in the center of the room. He didn't run to her. He stalked toward her, firing 3 shots to his left without even looking, dropping the last Morty guard who had popped up from behind a crate. The capo, realizing his men were dead, broke cover and sprinted for the rear exit. Marco raised his right hand, leveled the pistol, and fired once. The capo crumpled mid-stride, a bullet through the back of his knee. He screamed, thrashing on the concrete. Marco didn't finish him, he ignored him entirely. His focus was singular. "Don't come any closer." Richard Vane surged up from behind the pallets. In his shaking hand, he held a small revolver, pressing the barrel against Evelyn's temple. He hauled her chair back, using her body as a shield. He was crying, snot and tears running down his face, a pathetic caricature of a villain. "I'll do it," Richard screamed, his voice high and hysterical. "I swear to God, Marco, I'll blow her brains out. Back off. Get your men back." The warehouse fell silent. The tactical team froze, their weapons trained on Richard's head, waiting for the order. Marco stopped 10 feet away. He didn't raise his weapons. He slowly lowered his arms to his sides, the guns hanging loosely in his grip. His chest was heaving, his face splattered with grime and blood, but his expression was terrifyingly empty. "Richard," Marco said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a conversational tone, eerily calm amidst the carnage. "Look around you." "Shut up," Richard shrieked, pressing the gun harder against Evelyn's skin. She whimpered, closing her eyes, feeling the cold metal ring. "I want a car, I want a plane, and I want 5 million in crypto transferred now." "You are holding a gun to the only thing keeping you alive," Marco said, taking a slow step forward. "Stop walking," Richard yelled, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You think if you kill her, you leave here?" Marco asked, taking another step. "If you pull that trigger, Richard, death will be the kindness you beg for. I will keep you alive for weeks. I will peel the skin from your bones an inch at a time." Richard trembled, the horror of the threat sinking in. He looked at Marco's eyes and saw the abyss. He wavered, the gun barrel slipping slightly on Evelyn's sweat-slicked temple. "But," Marco continued, his voice softening, becoming almost hypnotic, "if you let her go, I will make it quick. 1 bullet, no pain. That is the only deal on the table." Richard sobbed, his resolve crumbling. He was a bully, not a soldier. He looked at the dead men on the floor, then at the monster standing before him. He knew it was over. The fight drained out of him. I didn't mean to," Richard stammered, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the weapon. "Let her go," Marco commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Richard pulled the gun away from Evelyn's head, stepping back, his hands raising in surrender. Okay, I surrender, just don't." The moment the gun left Evelyn's skin, Marco moved. He didn't shoot Richard. That would have been too impersonal. He crossed the remaining distance in a blur of motion. He holstered one gun and backhanded Richard across the face with the heavy barrel of the other. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the warehouse. Richard spun and hit the floor, spitting blood and teeth. Marco didn't look at him. He dropped to his knees in front of Evelyn. His hands, shaking for the first time that night, touched her face, checking her for injuries, wiping the grime from her cheeks. "Did he hurt you?" Marco demanded, his voice ragged. "Did he touch you?" "I'm okay," Evelyn whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I'm okay, you came." Marco pulled a knife from his belt and sliced the zip ties on her wrists and ankles with a single, fluid motion. As soon as she was free, Evelyn threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his blood-stained shirt. Marco held her so tight she thought her ribs might crack, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her scent as if it were oxygen. "I told you," he rasped against her ear. "I would burn the world to find you." A groan from the floor interrupted them. Richard was trying to crawl away, dragging his broken body toward the exit. Marco stiffened. He gently pulled Evelyn's arms from his neck and stood up. The tenderness vanished, replaced by the cold mechanic of execution. "Don't look," Marco said to her, his back to the crawling man. "Marco," Evelyn started, not sure what she was asking for. "Mercy, justice." "He knew the rules," Marco said, walking toward Richard. "He brought war to my doorstep. He touched what was mine." Richard rolled onto his back, looking up at Marco with wide, terrified eyes. "Marco, please, we grew up together, my father." "Your father will receive a closed casket," Marco said. He raised his gun. Evelyn didn't look away. She couldn't. She needed to see this. She needed to see the end of the fear that had ruled her life for 2 years. She watched as Marco, the man who had held her so gently moments ago, pulled the trigger. The gunshot was final. Richard Vane lay still. Marco stood over the body for a long moment, the silence of the warehouse heavy and absolute. Then he holstered his weapon and turned back to her. He didn't try to hide what he had done. He stood there, covered in the filth of his trade, waiting for her judgment. Waiting for her to scream, to run, to look at him with the same horror Richard had. Evelyn stood up on shaky legs. She looked at the dead body of her ex, then at the man who had killed him. She walked across the blood-stained concrete until she was standing right in front of Marco. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had just taken a life. "Take me home," she said. Marco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the gala. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckles, staining her skin with the blood of his enemies. "Let's go home." 3 weeks later. The air in Lake Como was different than the city. It was cleaner, thinner, smelling of cypress trees and deep, cold water. The villa sat on the edge of the lake, a masterpiece of Italian architecture that seemed to grow out of the cliffside. It was quiet here. No sirens, no gunfire, just the gentle lapping of waves against the stone dock. Evelyn sat on the terrace, a book resting forgotten on her lap, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. She wore a simple white linen dress, her hair loose and waving in the breeze. The bruises on her wrists had faded to nothing. The physical scars were gone, but the memories of the warehouse, of the gunshot, were etched into her mind forever. She heard the heavy oak door open behind her. Marco walked out onto the terrace. He had traded his suits for a casual cream sweater and dark trousers, but the dangerous edge was still there, lurking beneath the surface. He carried 2 glasses of wine, setting one down on the small iron table beside her. He didn't sit immediately. He leaned against the stone railing, looking at her with that intense, blue gaze that still made her shiver. "The police investigation is officially closed," Marco said quietly. "Richard's death was ruled a drug deal gone wrong. The Morty organization has fractured. They are no longer a threat." "And the warehouse?" Evelyn asked, picking up her wine. "Burned," Marco said simply. "Nothing left but slag." He watched her, gauging her reaction. Even here, in paradise, he was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for her to realize that she was living with a killer. "I have a plane on standby at the private airfield in Milan," Marco said suddenly. Evelyn looked up, surprised. "Are we leaving?" "You are," Marco said, his voice tight. He looked out at the lake, unable to meet her eyes. "I brought you here to heal, to let you breathe, but I cannot keep you here, Evelyn. This life, my life, it will always be this. There will always be another Richard, another Morty. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but eventually." He turned to face her, his expression pained. "I promised to protect you. The best way to do that is to let you go. I have set up an account and a name that cannot be traced. Enough money to live anywhere in the world. You can be free, truly free, from Richard, from the fear, and from me." Evelyn stared at him. She saw the sacrifice he was making. He was tearing his own heart out to give her a chance at a normal life. A life where she didn't have to worry about bodyguards or bulletproof glass. A life of safety. She stood up slowly, placing her glass on the table. She walked over to him, the linen of her dress fluttering around her legs. She stopped inches from him, looking up into his tortured face. "You think I want to be safe?" she asked softly. "Everyone wants to be safe," Marco replied hoarsely. "I was safe before I met you," Evelyn said. "I was safe in my apartment, hiding from the world, terrified of my own shadow. I was safe and I was dying." She reached up, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "You didn't just save my life, Marco. You gave me a life. You showed me that I'm not weak. You showed me that sometimes you have to be the monster to survive." "Evelyn," he warned, his voice breaking, "don't romance the darkness. It consumes everything." "Then let it consume us," she whispered, fierce and sure. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small and metallic. It was the shell casing from the bullet he had used to kill Richard. She had picked it up off the warehouse floor before they left. She held it up between them, a silver talisman of their bond. "I saw what you did," she said. "I saw the blood, I saw the violence, and I didn't look away. I chose you in that warehouse, Marco. I choose you now. I don't want a plane ticket. I don't want a normal life with a man who doesn't know what it means to burn the world for me." Marco stared at the shell casing, then at her. The walls he had tried to rebuild around his heart crumbled into dust. He let out a ragged groan and pulled her to him, his mouth crashing down on hers with a desperate, consuming hunger. It was a kiss of possession, of gratitude, of absolute surrender. He lifted her up, sitting her on the edge of the stone railing, stepping between her legs to pull her as close as physically possible. "You stay," he growled against her lips. "You stay, and you never leave. You are the queen of this city now, Evelyn, and God help anyone who disrespects the queen." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, wrapping her arms around his neck. As the sun finally set behind the mountains, casting the lake in shades of violet and gold, Marco and Evelyn stood together in the fading light. They were not a fairy tale. They were not a conventional romance. They were something sharper, darker, and infinitely more durable. They were two survivors who had found their home in each other's shadows, ready to rule the empire they had forged in blood. And for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss didn't fear the future. He held it in his arms.